So today's gospel is a tough one. It's in Luke chapter 14, where before today's gospel reading, Christ went and he was eating at one of the Pharisees' house on the Sabbath. And this was one of the instances where he asked them, if I heal a man on the Sabbath, is it lawful? All right. And so Jesus shares a parable with them all. And he says, the parable of the Great Supper, where a man invites everyone to come join him, but everyone starts giving excuses and does not come to the dinner. And so this is where, once those events finish, this is where our gospel kicks off, where, as we just read, now great multitudes went with him, and he turned and said to them, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and his mother, his wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. And whoever does not bear his cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. And this is a very, very tough verse, where as Christ is telling people here that if you want to truly follow him, you must reject giving your heart to anything in the world. Anything that compromises your commitment to Christ, you need to be able to reject that in order to be able to follow him. And he says specifically, if you do, he cannot be my disciple if you're not able to reject those things. And further, he states that whoever does not bear up his cross and come after him cannot be my disciples. So let's ask the question, what does it mean to bear a cross? And it's interesting because this is a term that we use fairly commonly. Like, we say it to one another, we hear it, especially when someone has a big cross to carry. It's something that we generally say to one another. It's a common phrase. So for example, if someone is dealing with a family member who is suffering from a terminal illness and it impacts their whole life, and it really changes every single aspect, and it causes a lot of spiritual, emotional, mental pain, people tend to say to them, you carry a big cross. If you have a crazy boss at work who just gives you a crazy hard time, and what you care about is doing a really, really good job, and they don't care to see that, so you're suffering every day while you're at work, people tend to say, you carry a big cross. If your job is to fly across the country and go to different customer sites, and your last name is Abdullah and you have a beard and you're brown, and you have to deal with TSA every week, people tend to say to him, you carry a big cross. If you have a whole bunch of kids at home and they're just making constant noise and you can't eat, sleep, or do anything or have any alone quiet time, well, from what I've been told, that's not carrying a cross. That's making my own decisions, and now I have to suffer those consequences. But either way, actually, one of the funniest moments that have happened to me personally, in North Carolina, we have this thing that we would do at church. It would be a bazaar where we would have food for the public and offices to come, and it's basically like a fundraiser for church. And so I would go and I would spend a lot of time out there. And not just to work, but so for those that don't know, I love actually playing tawla, or backgammon, for those that don't know. And I used to do it all the time. And my giddo taught me, it was something I really enjoyed doing when I was a lot younger. But I would go to this bazaar, and then there was this group of uncles that I used to play with. So I would go and I'd play tawla with them. And for those of you that don't know, when you put a backgammon board or a tawla board in front of a group of Middle Eastern men, they become, I don't care how humble they are, I don't care how spiritual, they become the most competitive people that you ever see in the face of the earth. It's like the spirit of all trash talkers come upon them when that tawla board is in front of them, and they are there and they are ready to play. So one of the biggest mistakes in my life, I love playing regular tawla. Mahbusa is I don't know, I don't enjoy it. But apparently I was disrespecting my family by not enjoying mahbusa. So I decided to play with them. One of the biggest mistakes I ever make in my life. And like I'll bear you, I'll like spare you all the details, but basically I get wrecked so bad in that game. And I'll spare the details, but it involves basically one of my pieces at the very beginning of the board getting covered, where literally I can't do anything until he finishes beating me. I can't play until he finishes beating me. So not until he wins. He has to finish beating me in order for me to make a move. And so I'll never forget, this uncle and his squad, they're just like, again, trash talking, like, and they're throwing pieces across, and they're just doing this whole thing. And I'll never forget, this one tant came very gently, and she comes and she puts her arm around me and tubs alayya, and she goes, معلش حبيبي انت شايل صليب يعني تقيلة قوي معلش ما ربنا موجود ربنا موجود. And I'm like, wait, what the hell? Like, I felt comfort though when she said it. But that was like my biggest like يعني شايل صليب ربنا موجود moment. But this is not what we're talking about here, right? This is not the example of carry your cross that like Christ is like really depicting here. So instead of using my terrible example, let's look at what Christ did. Let's look at what Christ did in his life to carry his cross. So Christ came and he was sentenced to death for the cross. He was sentenced to death not because he did anything wrong, and not because they arrested him on things that he incorrectly did that broke the law. The sentence came because others were jealous of him and they were fearful of his followers growing. He took the sins of all, whether they were sinners that were with him or against him, he took the sins of all to bring them to salvation. And he did not cause people to sin, right? Nothing was his fault. But what he did is he took the blame and he took up his cross and fulfilled his mission. So nothing was his fault. He did not cause anything. But still, he decided to take up the sins of the world, bear his cross, and give us salvation. So this is what Christ did when he carried his cross to complete his mission. He kept pressing forward no matter the burdens. So something to call out here in the verse is that Christ does not specifically say, whoever does not bear my cross, right? He's not talking about his own cross that he bore. He said, whoever does not carry his cross. Basically, if we look at this, each of us have our own individual crosses to bear. We each have our own unique version of a cross that we bear. It is not a one-size-fits-all. Everyone has a different situation. So it's not a generic statement when he says, everyone needs to hate his father and his mother, his wife, his children, brothers and sisters, yes, his own life. It's not a generic statement that goes, oh yeah, okay, I hate myself and I hate the people I'm around, check, cool, I'm bearing my cross, right? But it's a more very personable and effective life around our own situations that impact us. Those are our unique crosses that we have. So then the question becomes, what is my personal cross to carry? So there's a few things we can pick up from today's readings, the Pauline, the Catholic, and the Acts, that help us describe what does it mean to be carrying a cross and how we should be reacting to that cross. And so I want to reflect on that with you today. So let's first start with the Pauline. So St. Paul mentions to the Thessalonians today, he says, we ourselves boast of you, talking to the Thessalonians, we boast of you among the churches of God for your patience and faith in all your persecutions and tribulations that you endure, which is manifest evident of the righteous judgment of God. So here, he's saying, he used two words. You have to have the patience and faith in all of your persecutions and tribulations. So persecutions are the things that we get harassed for, that are outside of our control. And they're generally, and you get a lot of hostility. So generally, it's like things, gender, religion, whatever it is. Those are general things that you get persecuted for. Tribulations are things that cause great suffering, right? And so whenever you have those two things, generally we're victims of something. We're not the aggressors, we're victims of something when we face tribulations and persecutions. So let's reflect on those things. What are the persecutions in that we endure? Persecutions and tribulations that we endure. But again, the important part here, with the context we're talking about, is with following Christ. What do we endure while we are following Christ? Not what do we endure in general. What do we endure as we follow him? How are we responding to those things? Right? Are we doing it with patience and faith, like what St. Paul is here mentioning? Or are we on the attack, trying to justify ourselves and defend ourselves and protect ourselves and take it into our own hands rather than leaving it in God's hands? So those persecutions and tribulations, how are we responding to them? Next thing, let's look at Catholic. St. Peter today talks about, in the Catholic epistle, he says, "For we have spent enough of our past lifetime doing the will of the Gentiles when we walked in lewdness, lusts, drunkenness, revelries, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries. In regard to these, they think it strange that you do not run with them in the same flood of dissipation, speaking evil of you. They will give an account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead." So this one is actually really challenging, and we face this at some point in our lives, is that you are doing things that are not pleasing to God. You fell off the wayside, for lack of a better term. But then you're moved by the Spirit to change your life. And you're trying to do the right thing and follow him. You're trying to pick up your cross and follow him. Those people who used to be your friends, that you used to do all of these things with, not only no longer become your friends, but they're now even your enemies, and they're speaking evil against you. And what it does is it makes you start doubting the choices that you made. It makes you start doubting, is this really the road that I want to go on? Look, I decided to make this change to better me, but look at all this noise that I'm getting. People are hating me, they're speaking evil, they're giving me a hard time. Should I go? And you start beginning doubting the change that you made. And you start wanting to consider going back to the old ways, like what St. Peter is saying here. The will of the Gentiles, walking in lewdness, lust, drunkenness, etc. Right? This is a very, very challenging piece. And it's a very, very big cross to bear to be in that kind of situation where you transform your life and you try to become closer to the image that God has intended for us. By doing that, you are now choosing to go through the narrow gate. And we know the narrow gate where Christ mentions it, one of the references in Matthew chapter 7. He says, "Enter by the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the way that leads to destruction. And there are many people who go in by it." So the gate that is really wide, that everyone's going through easily, leads to destruction. But the narrow gate is the one that leads you to that everlasting life. So knowing that the narrow gate is much harder to go through and less people go through it makes it that much more difficult to turn back from what you've overcome. You've become different, and people hate you for being different. People hate what's different. But the fact that you're able to overcome that old life, that old man, and become something new, know that it's not going to be an easier thing. The overcoming is just the start of the battle, but dealing with all of the noise that comes after it is a much bigger challenge as well. So St. Peter gives us some counsel on how to help us keep us going forward in these things. He says in the same Catholic, he says, "Therefore be serious and watchful in your prayers. And above all things have fervent love for one another, for love will cover a multitude of sins. Be hospitable to one another without grumbling." So what he's saying here, and the counsel he's giving us, in those situations, you have to take your prayer life more serious. The more you pray, and the more that you're serious about your prayer, rather than being empty prayers, the better you are connected with God. And he is the one that's going to protect you through these hard times. Have that fervent love for one another. And for those that don't know, fervent means to display passionately, intensely. So have that real, intense, true love for one another. And finally, he says, be hospitable without grumbling. So do things to support one another without complaining. So that is the counsel that St. Peter gives us as we go through that transformation and that change where we're picking up our cross. That is a big cross to go through, and it's a big cross to carry when you are overcoming your personal challenges and temptations, and then you have to deal with the rest of the world that judges those temptations and speak evil of you and give you a hard time. So following these things that St. Peter tells us. And last, let's look at the Acts and see what happens there. So the Acts today, we read about how the people of a city are worried about the teaching that the disciples are doing and how they're teaching and preaching the name of Jesus. And what they do is they have the one man, what was his name? Gamaliel. I'm not good with names, but Gamaliel. Gamaliel. All right. So he basically tells them, listen, we've had these situations before, and look how it's led to destruction. Let it go. Don't worry about it. It'll be fine. Let's see how the apostles and the disciples react to that. He says, and they agreed with him. And when they had called for the apostles, they had beaten them and commanded that they should not speak the name of Jesus and let them go. How did they respond? So they departed from the presence of their council, rejoicing that they were counted worthy to suffer shame for his name. Rejoicing that they suffered shame. Happy that they got a hard time. Happy that they got beaten. So the disciples were beaten not for breaking the law, but for preaching Christ. So they were carrying their cross by doing that. But the important part here for us to take away as well is their response. How do they respond to carrying that cross? They rejoice to be counted worthy to suffer the shame for his name. So these guys are persecuting them, and they're trying to be all smart about it. And they're like, hey, let them go. All the people that are going to follow them are dying. They're going to die. It's not a big deal. But those guys are playing checkers. The disciples are playing chess. There's a bigger plan involved here. So Christ warned them that things would be difficult, warned the disciples specifically. He says in Matthew, he says, then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. So they heard firsthand from Christ. They heard it directly from his mouth that it's not going to be easy, and people are going to give you the hardest time in the world. They will kill you, tribulations, negativity, etc., etc., etc. So when they heard that directly from Christ, and now they're seeing it in person, they're seeing it directly, firsthand, what do? They respond with joy. Why? Why did they respond with joy? They knew they were on the right path. They knew this is what Christ told us was going to happen. We are seeing it happen. That means what? We're doing the right thing. We are on the right path. I'm excited. Right? This is what we need to be able to take away from the disciples. Here in the Acts, we see this message specifically. Having an easier time does not mean you're right on the right path. Going through those tribulations and difficulty, just as Christ told us was going to happen, that's where we need to find joy. We need to know that we're going to struggle when we carry our crosses. And that should bring us joy and comfort, because that is exactly what Christ told us was going to happen. If you go and you get directions from someone, and they tell you, hey, you're going to pass by a McDonald's, and then when you see that, you're right there. You keep driving, you're feeling good, you never see that McDonald's. How should you feel? You feel worried. Uh-oh, I missed something. Right? Same thing here. If Christ is telling us, you are going to have tribulations, they're going to be giving you the business, you're going to be having a hard time, we should be joyful. And that is not an easy thing to do by any means. I need to be very clear about that. It is not an easy thing to all of a sudden go, oh, look at all these terrible things that happened to me. Light switch, click, hey, I'm happy now. That is not an easy thing. This is something that we have to be working very hard and very intentionally to do. And it goes along the lines with what St. Peter tells us. This is why our fervent prayers, our prayers with God that actually connect us, they help us, comfort us in being able to overcome these things. It's a very big, challenging thing. And this is what we have to strive to work through. Like if you're trying to work out or prepare for a marathon, it's not an overnight thing where you decide, boom, I'm going to go run that marathon. You have to train for months and practice becoming better for this. This is the same thing here. The disciples spent 3 years with Christ. There was a lot of practice here. we want to be able to do that too and have that same kind of response that they're having here. So to wrap up, I want to share a message from His Holiness Pope Shenouda. He wrote an article back in the early 2000s, and it was an article about optimism and hope. And so he says in this article, he says, "If a man has faith inside of his heart, he shall see prosperity in everything. Man will then not see the current darkness, but he will look at the light that will come." In other words, optimism is not seeing what's happening now, but what has God prepared for us later on. Optimism and the hope is not seeing what's happening now, but what's happening later on. And he goes in this article and gives some examples of the life of the saints. So I want to dig and share with you all what he says about Joseph. So as we read this, I want you guys to reflect on what we're talking about here with Joseph when he was saying, Joseph bearing his cross. So he says, Joseph had many discomforts in his life. His brothers envied to him to the point that they sold him as a slave. And in spite of his faithfulness in Potiphar's house, he was unfairly accused of dishonesty and was thrown into jail, where he stayed a while. Look at that cross that Joseph had to bear in his life for doing nothing, for doing the right thing, right? For doing nothing wrong and doing the right thing. Those were his trials and tribulations. So Pope Shenouda continues. He says, "But hope was always in front of him. Let's see what God did with him. Joseph became the second in the kingdom, a father to Pharaoh and a lord of his house, a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt. His brothers came to him and kneeled between his arms. He saw his father Jacob and his brother Benjamin, and his sons were blessed by his father and lived 110 years." So here, Pope Shenouda is calling out how things were extremely rough for Joseph. He did not have an easy time by making the right choices. But look at how the things went for those who love God and are trying to follow Him and His will for us. How things got much better. So Pope Shenouda breaks it down in a beautiful way for us to meditate on as we wrap this up. He says, "There is not any difficulty that lasts forever. There is not any difficulty that lasts forever. However long it may stay, it will come to an end, and the difficulty rises in a pyramid shape till it reaches its top pinnacle and then slides downward and ends. It will come to an end. It will end in a good way. Yes, indeed, everything goes for the best because God is present. By the optimistic view, meaning with hope, you know with certainty that God will intervene. And when God intervenes, He definitely will do, and all the problems will be solved, all the difficulties will go away, and the situation will be fixed. So with that, let us pick up our crosses and follow Him through patience, faith, and hope. And we need to know that as we go through this struggle, Rabbina Mawgood, and He's going to help us overcome, and the end will be better than that tribulation we're going through. Glory be to God forever. Amen.